Hello there. I'd like to talk about my observations with respect to female combatants in the war in El Salvador. Although many militaries nowadays have got women in combat roles, not so many employ them on the front line, and not so many have experience of women fighting on the front line. Guerrilla groups throughout history have utilized women, but often in a support role, not in a frontline role. So, what did they look like? This slide shows you two typical combatientes against the background of their chalkboard of their little school. Every Fmln camp that I visited had a little lean-to thatch shed with a chalkboard where they would try to do education and schooling for their fighters. Many of their fighters were teenagers, and many had been since 7 or 8 years old in the Fmln and therefore had had no formal schooling whatsoever. These two young women were very typical. Although this is a stock photo, I met many like them. In fact, I'm not even sure that the one on the right wasn't in one of the camps that I visited myself. The typical day for these young Fmln fighters, men and women, were that they would get up before sunrise, have a very simple breakfast, often just a little spoonful of rice and a spoonful of beans, and they would get their patrol orders. They were issued each and counted out each 100 bullets. You'll notice that they've got American rifles. There were no Kalashnikovs there because it's so difficult to get ammunition for that, whereas for the Fmln, stealing government ammunition was really quite easy. The soldiers patrolled. Each patrol could have 30 to 40% women in it. Women were used a lot as radio operators because the very poor quality handheld radios that they had were clearer, or the voice messages were clearer with a higher pitched woman's voice. And many of the radioistas, as they were called, had started working like that at 7 or 8 years old. So they also rose to positions of importance. And I'd like you to see this next slide. This is a lady who I had the privilege of meeting. Her name is Nidia Diaz. She was very clever, very tough. She went from being a foot soldier up to being a commander, a comandante. And late on in the war, she was captured by the government and held in captivity, tortured very badly for 6 months, and was eventually exchanged for a whole bunch of government prisoners, including the daughter of the president of the country. That's how much the Fmln wanted her back. I met Nidia when we were in the very mature stage of the peace process, and there was essentially a ceasefire that was holding. I was privileged to fly as her escort on a number of occasions, and as well as seeing her very tough with the senior military officers that she was interacting with, I saw her being really sensitive and considerate when she was talking to the ordinary peasants, the completely illiterate campesinos, who would gather round, and she would talk to them about the future, what the Fmln wanted as a new El Salvador. And she was the real package. She had proved her physical resistance under torture. She had led soldiers from the front, and she had a real vision and a voice for the future. She was an outstanding person and an outstanding military leader. So let's have a look at my personal observations through the Fmln framework of how I see this situation. One of the things from the obvious domain, which was really quite strange for us to see when we visited in the camps, one of these patrols would get back at around dusk. They'd been out sometimes 10, 12 hours patrolling their particular area. Whilst the men kind of took off their kit, did a little bit with their weapons, securing them and whatever, the women had to do all of that, and then at least half of them would go off to the kitchen to start doing the preparation of the evening meal. There was no suggestion that having shared the equal burden in the field, that the men should then share the equal burden in the kitchen. It never happened once. I never saw it. The women were in charge of all of the domestic stuff, as well as the fighting stuff that they did. And so it's true to say that they did twice as much work as the men. They were famous as their radioistas, the ones who operated the little handheld radios and did the tactical communications out in the field. In the complicated domain, there were some interesting interactions between the senior United Nations military observers that came from all kinds of countries. They were unarmed officers, but they were up to lieutenant colonel rank, and they were very unused, most of them, to dealing with women either as soldiers, and particularly women as senior officers of their own rank or higher. And the cultural clashes that happened there were really quite interesting. They weren't made by the women being difficult. They were made by the fact that the international men were just not used to dealing with women in these situations. In the complex domain, it was probably the most important of all the issues that came out of this particular phenomenon of women in combat. A cadre of really capable women leaders who had confidence, who had fought, who had suffered, who had seen their people killed, evolved into a very strong leadership cadre for the country as it developed. And even more than their tactical capability in the field, which was unquestioned, the fact that they could contribute fearlessly to the post-war political process of their own country in their own way was an enormous step forward, very hard won, a lot of price paid for that, but it was absolutely the legacy of the war and its conditions for post-war El Salvador.